In the tight-knit communities of West Virginia, family bonds often run deeper than blood. But few relationships were as profound as the one between Zilpha Flores and her nephew Jeremiah Pittman. To call them aunt and nephew seemed inadequate. They were more like siblings, bound together by shared trauma and a fierce, protective love that transcended the typical boundaries of family relationships. Zilpha was the heart of her family. Her nieces, Reba Flores and Kari Gonzalez, adored her. She worked as a waitress at a local truck stop, greeting regulars with genuine warmth that made the fluorescent-lit diner feel almost like home. She had a sensitivity about her, an intuition that made her especially attuned to the people she loved. And nobody did she love more fiercely than Jeremiah. Jeremiah Pittman was a young man of few words. His quiet demeanor masked a childhood scarred by neglect and instability. His father, Eddie Pittman, was a man whose very presence carried the threat of violence. Eddie was absent when it mattered, and volatile when he was around, a toxic combination that left Jeremiah to navigate his formative years largely alone. Except for Zilpha. Where Eddie failed, Zilpha stepped in. She became the stable presence in Jeremiah's life, the one person who checked on him, fed him, listened to him. She saw the scared boy beneath the quiet exterior, recognized the weight he carried from a childhood no one should have to endure. Their bond wasn't just about affection, it was about survival. The incident that would forever cement their connection happened years before either of them disappeared. Eddie Pittman, in one of his characteristically unhinged episodes, decided to burn down his girlfriend's house. But moments before striking the match, he turned to Jeremiah and Zilpha, who were both present, and told them to leave. They watched from a distance as flames consumed the structure, smoke billowing into the West Virginia sky. Neither of them reported what they had witnessed. The silence that followed the arson wasn't just about fear of Eddie's retribution, though that fear was very real. It was also about the complicated dynamics of family loyalty, the paralyzing uncertainty about what speaking up might unleash, and the shared understanding that they were bound together by this terrible secret. That silence created an unspoken covenant between them. They had witnessed something horrific together, and in their mutual decision not to speak, they became each other's only confidant. It was a burden that drew them closer, even as it isolated them from everyone else. Jeremiah's life remained unstable. He bounced between friends' homes, never quite finding solid ground. Eddie continued to cast a long shadow over his existence, a constant reminder that safety was an illusion. But through it all, Zilpha remained his anchor. She checked in on him constantly, worried about him openly, and made sure he knew that someone cared whether he lived or died. For Zilpha, protecting Jeremiah wasn't just an obligation, it was a calling. She couldn't undo his traumatic childhood, couldn't erase the memories of Eddie's violence, couldn't repair the damage already done. But she could be present. She could love him fiercely. She could create a small sphere of safety in an otherwise chaotic world. The family noticed their closeness. Reba and Kari saw how Zilpha's face would light up when Jeremiah walked into a room, how she would instinctively reach for him, how her worry lines deepened whenever she went too long without hearing from him. They understood that Zilpha and Jeremiah shared something none of them could fully comprehend, a bond forged in fire, literally and figuratively. What none of them could have known in those years before 1992 was that this bond would become central to one of West Virginia's most haunting cold cases. The very connection that gave them both strength would ultimately make them targets. The secrets they kept would transform from protective silence into dangerous knowledge. As 1992 began, neither Zilpha nor Jeremiah could have imagined that their shared trauma, their protective love for each other, and their terrible secret about Eddie would soon lead them both into darkness. The fire they had watched Eddie set years before was nothing compared to the inferno of violence that was about to consume them both. Their story, one of loyalty, intuition, and unspeakable brutality, would remain buried for years, much like Jeremiah's body would be. And when the truth finally emerged, it would shock everyone who thought they knew this quiet young man and his devoted aunt. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came with the discovery of Jeremiah Pittman's truck. It sat abandoned along the interstate, driver's door slightly ajar, keys gone, no indication of where its owner had gone or why he would have left his only means of transportation behind. Jeremiah had been living with friends in the months before he vanished. a typical arrangement for a young man whose relationship with his father was too volatile to allow for cohabitation. His living situation was precarious but manageable. He worked odd jobs, kept mostly to himself, and checked in regularly with Zilpha, who worried about him constantly. When his friends were questioned about his disappearance, their accounts were frustratingly vague. They said Jeremiah had mentioned going to see his father, Eddie Pittman. They claimed he had left voluntarily, that there had been no signs of distress or struggle. One day he was there, and the next, he simply wasn't. But the abandoned truck told a different story. Jeremiah wasn't the type to walk away from his vehicle without explanation. He wasn't someone who would vanish without telling the one person who mattered most to him, Zilpha. When Zilpha learned that Jeremiah was missing, her reaction was immediate and visceral. This wasn't a young man taking off on an impromptu trip. This wasn't someone who needed space or wanted to disappear for a while. Something was wrong. She felt it in her bones. She went to the authorities, her anxiety palpable, insisting they investigate immediately. But law enforcement's response was measured at best, dismissive at worst. Young men took off all the time, they explained. There was no evidence of foul play. The truck being abandoned was unusual, certainly, but not conclusive proof of anything criminal. Perhaps he had gotten a ride with someone. Perhaps he would turn up in a few days. The official reluctance to act was crushing for Zilpha. She knew Jeremiah in ways others didn't. She understood his patterns, his fears, his desperate need for the few stable connections he had in life. He could never disappear without telling her. The certainty in her voice, when she insisted something terrible had happened, should have been enough to launch a serious investigation, but it wasn't. Days turned into weeks. Jeremiah remained missing. The family grew increasingly desperate, but the investigation stalled before it even properly began. With each passing day, Zilpha's anxiety intensified, manifesting in sleepless nights and constant replaying of her last conversations with her nephew. Then came the dream. Zilpha confided first in Reba and Kari, her voice shaking as she described what she had seen in her sleep. It wasn't a vague nightmare or symbolic imagery. It was vivid, detailed, horrifyingly specific. In the dream, she saw Jeremiah murdered. She saw Eddie Pittman, Jeremiah's father, striking him down with brutal force. She saw the remote location where the body was buried. And she saw something else, something that would later prove to be the most chilling detail of all. She saw lime covering the body. Lime calcium oxide was sometimes used to accelerate decomposition or mask the smell of decay. It was the kind of detail that wouldn't occur to someone unless they had specific knowledge about concealing a body. For Zilpha to dream about lime specifically was unsettling in ways that transcended normal anxiety about a missing loved one. The family didn't know what to make of the dream. Was it grief manifesting as terrible visions? Was it Zilpha's subconscious processing her worst fears about Eddie? Or was it something else entirely, intuition, so powerful it manifested as prophetic imagery? Zilpha herself seemed torn between rational dismissal and bone-deep certainty. She wanted to believe it was just a nightmare, the product of stress and fear. But the vividness of it haunted her. The details felt too real, too specific. She began to wonder if somehow, on some level, she knew what had happened to Jeremiah. Her conviction that Eddie was responsible became unshakable. She spoke openly within the family about her suspicions, about the dream, about her belief that Jeremiah was dead and that his father had killed him. Some family members shared her certainty. Others worried that grief and fear were clouding her judgment. But Zilpha couldn't let it go. The dream replayed in her mind constantly. The image of Jeremiah buried in a remote location, lime scattered over his remains, became an obsession. She felt guilty for not being able to protect him, haunted by the thought that she might know where he was but couldn't prove it. She went back to the authorities multiple times, trying to explain her certainty, her dream, her conviction that they needed to search Eddie's property or areas he was known to frequent. But without evidence, without a body, without anything concrete to investigate, law enforcement maintained their position. Jeremiah was an adult who had left of his own accord. There was no case to pursue. The dismissal was agonizing for Zilpha. She felt she was screaming into a void, that the one person who might still need her help was lying dead somewhere, while everyone told her to calm down and wait. The frustration compounded her grief, which compounded her fear. What Zilpha didn't know what she couldn't have known was that her dream, her vocal suspicions about Eddie, and her refusal to let Jeremiah's disappearance fade into obscurity might be putting her own life in danger. If Eddie really had killed Jeremiah, and if Zilpha's intuition or knowledge was getting too close to the truth, she had just made herself a threat. The eerie accuracy of her dream would only become apparent later, after tragedy struck again. But in those weeks after Jeremiah vanished, Zilpha carried the terrible burden of knowing something she couldn't prove, seeing something in her sleep that terrified her in her waking hours, and feeling utterly powerless to bring her nephew home. Her bond with Jeremiah, once a source of strength, had become a conduit for unbearable grief and inexplicable knowing. The secrets they had kept together about Eddie's violence were giving way to a new, more terrible secret, one that Zilpha might have intuited, but couldn't yet confirm. The truck stop where Zilpha Flores worked was the kind of place where regulars knew your name and strangers were welcomed with tired but genuine smiles. Zilpha had been a fixture there for years, serving coffee and eggs to early morning drivers, listening to their stories, sending them off with a warmth that made the lonely highway feel a little less isolating. It was also the last place anyone saw her alive. The timeline of Zilpha's disappearance was eerily similar to Jeremiah's, occurring just months after her nephew vanished. She showed up for her shift one day, seemed normal to her coworkers, and then simply failed to appear the next. Her absence was immediately notable. Zilpha wasn't someone who missed work without calling, wasn't someone who would leave people waiting without explanation. The family's alarm was instantaneous and absolute. Reba and Carrie immediately suspected the worst. They knew about Zilpha's dream, her vocal suspicions about Eddie, her insistence that Jeremiah had been murdered, and now she too was gone. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Two people, deeply connected, both disappearing within months of each other. Both last seen under circumstances that suggested they were going about their normal lives, then vanishing without trace or warning. Both cases involving Eddie Pittman directly in Jeremiah's case, indirectly in Zilpha's, through her accusations. But once again, law enforcement's response was frustratingly inadequate. Zilpha was an adult. There was no evidence of abduction or foul play. Perhaps she had decided to leave, they suggested. Perhaps the stress of Jeremiah's disappearance had become too much. Perhaps she needed space. The family was incredulous. Zilpha wouldn't leave. She couldn't leave, not with Jeremiah still missing, not without resolving the terrible uncertainty about her nephew's fate. Leaving would be abandoning him, and Zilpha would never do that. Her entire life had been built around showing up for the people she loved, especially Jeremiah. The suggestion that her disappearance was voluntary felt like a deliberate dismissal of everything the family was trying to communicate. They weren't hysterical relatives inventing crisis. They were people who knew Zilpha intimately, who understood her patterns and priorities, who recognized that her vanishing was absolutely inconsistent with everything she had ever been or done. But the official position remained unchanged. Without evidence of foul play, without a body, without witnesses to an abduction or attack, there was no criminal investigation to pursue. Zilpha's disappearance was logged, noted, and essentially shelved alongside her nephew's. The community reaction was complex. Some shared the family's suspicions, believed that Eddie Pittman was somehow responsible for both disappearances, and felt frustrated by the lack of official action. Others were more skeptical, wondering if the family's grief was leading them to see connections that didn't exist. And still others simply didn't want to believe that such terrible violence could be happening in their midst. But within the family, certainty was growing. Zilpha's dream about Jeremiah was now impossible to dismiss as mere anxiety. It felt prophetic, a terrible premonition that had proven true. And if the dream had been accurate about Jeremiah's death, what else might Zilpha have known or intuited? Questions began to multiply. Had Zilpha's dream been just a dream? Or had she somehow known what happened to Jeremiah? Had she possessed dangerous knowledge that she'd been afraid to voice directly? Had her accusations against Eddie been more than grief-fueled suspicion? Had they been based on something concrete she'd learned? The most chilling possibility was that Zilpha hadn't just dreamed about what happened to Jeremiah, she might have known. And if Eddie had killed Jeremiah and Zilpha knew or strongly suspected, she would have become an unbearable threat. Her vocal insistence about Eddie's guilt, her detailed dream, her refusal to let the case drop all of it, could have painted a target on her back. The family tormented themselves with these questions. Should they have taken Zilpha's fears more seriously? Should they have protected her better? Had she tried to warn them in ways they hadn't understood? The guilt was overwhelming. Meanwhile, the investigation, such as it was, went nowhere. Law enforcement had 2 missing people, an abandoned truck, a grieving family, and absolutely no evidence to pursue. The cases grew cold almost immediately, filed away among the countless other disappearances that occur each year without resolution. Months passed. The family continued to pressure authorities, but with no new information, there was nothing to investigate. The community's attention began to drift to other concerns. Life moved on for everyone except those who loved Jeremiah and Zilpha. Reba and Carrie found themselves trapped in a terrible limbo. They couldn't properly grieve because there were no bodies, no confirmation of death. But they also couldn't hope for reunion because the circumstances made survival seem impossible. They existed in a gray space between mourning and waiting, unable to move forward, unable to go back. The bond between Zilpha and Jeremiah, once a source of warmth and stability, had become the axis around which tragedy spun. Their shared trauma, their protective love, their secret knowledge about Eddie, all of it seemed to have led them both into darkness. What the family didn't know, couldn't know, was that the truth was even more complex and horrifying than they imagined. The answers they sought were out there, waiting to be uncovered. But when those answers finally came, they would bring closure for one victim while raising even more disturbing questions about the other. The silence that Jeremiah and Zilpha had maintained after witnessing Eddie's arson years before was giving way to a different kind of silence, the silence of death, of secrets buried literally and figuratively, of violence hidden just beneath the surface of everyday life. Zilpha had worried she couldn't protect Jeremiah. In the end, she couldn't even protect herself. The hunters, who stumbled upon Zilpha Flores' remains near Lake James that day, were following a trail they'd walked dozens of times before. The area was remote, beautiful in the way that West Virginia wilderness often is. Dense trees, quiet except for bird calls and wind rustling through leaves. The kind of place where you could walk for hours without seeing another person. What they found shattered that peaceful isolation forever. Zilpha's body lay on the ground surface, not buried, but simply abandoned. Her clothing was there, along with a sheet and a towel, details that would later prove crucial to understanding where and how she died. But it was the condition of her skull that told the most immediate and brutal story. Her head had been crushed. The trauma was severe, unmistakable evidence of extreme violence. Whatever had struck her had done so with enough force to cave in bone, to end her life instantly, or nearly so. This wasn't a death that came from a single blow in the heat of anger. This was sustained, brutal, intentional destruction. The location told investigators something important. Zilpha hadn't died here. The lack of burial, the presence of her belongings, the ground disturbance, all of it suggested she had been killed elsewhere, and her body dumped in these woods, far from where anyone would think to look for her. When word reached the family, the grief was compounded by the horror of imagining Zilpha's final moments. She had been murdered with savage violence, her body discarded like refuse in the wilderness. The woman who had spent her life caring for others had been shown no mercy, no dignity, even in death. But grief quickly crystallized into something else: certainty about who was responsible. The family immediately focused on Eddie Pittman. He was violent, he had opportunity. Jeremiah was still missing, presumably dead by Eddie's hand, if Zilpha's dream was to be believed. And Zilpha had been vocal about her suspicions, had accused Eddie openly, had made it clear she believed he had murdered her nephew. From the family's perspective, the timeline made terrible sense. Eddie kills Jeremiah. Zilpha dreams about it or knows about it and starts making accusations. Eddie can't risk her talking, can't risk her drawing attention that might lead investigators to Jeremiah's body. So he silences her too, brutally and permanently. The community pressure on law enforcement intensified. 2 people from the same family, both dead or missing, both connected to Eddie Pittman. How could this be coincidence? How could there not be an investigation? And then came the break that would transform the case entirely. Rosemary Gehring walked into the sheriff's office, visibly terrified, and told investigators that Eddie Pittman was planning to kill her next. Rosemary was Eddie's girlfriend, or had been. She had been part of his life during the period when Jeremiah disappeared. And now, faced with what she knew and could no longer live with, she was prepared to tell investigators everything, but only if they could protect her. What Rosemary revealed was staggering in its specificity. She didn't just suspect Eddie had killed Jeremiah. She had witnessed it. She had been there when it happened. She knew exactly where the body was buried because she had watched Eddie dig the grave. And she could take investigators directly to the location. The search party that followed Rosemary into the remote areas of the county was prepared for the worst, but even braced for grim discoveries. The reality was stunning in its validation of everything Zilpha had dreamed. Jeremiah's remains were exactly where Rosemary said they would be, buried in a remote ditch, far from any traveled road, in a location that no one would stumble upon by accident. The body had been there for months, undiscovered, until Rosemary's confession led investigators directly to the spot. But the most chilling detail was what investigators found with the remains: lime. Zilpha's dream had been horrifyingly accurate. She had seen Jeremiah murdered by his father. She had seen him buried in a remote location. And she had seen lime covering his body, a specific, unusual detail that she couldn't have known unless she had somehow witnessed the burial herself or been told about it directly. The medical examiner's report confirmed blunt force trauma as the cause of death. Jeremiah had been struck repeatedly with a hammer, his skull damaged in ways that paralleled the injuries found on Zilpha's remains. The same method, the same brutal efficiency, the same crushing head wounds. The connection between the two murders became undeniable. Whether Eddie had killed both or only Jeremiah, there was clearly a link between the cases. The timeline, the method, the geography, all of it pointed to a coordinated pattern of violence. For the family, Rosemary's confession brought both relief and renewed agony. They finally knew what had happened to Jeremiah, finally had confirmation that Zilpha's instincts had been absolutely correct. But that confirmation came with the terrible knowledge that Zilpha had likely been killed specifically because she knew or suspected too much. The accuracy of Zilpha's dream haunted everyone involved in the case. How had she known about the lime? Had Eddie told her something in a moment of careless confession? Had she witnessed the burial without Rosemary realizing she was there? Or had her intuition about Jeremiah been so powerful that her subconscious mind constructed the exact scenario of his death? The possibilities were all disturbing in different ways. If Eddie had told her, it meant he'd been testing her loyalty or threatening her. If she'd witnessed it, she'd been carrying that traumatic knowledge alone, terrified to speak. If it was pure intuition, it suggested a bond between Zilpha and Jeremiah so profound that she somehow knew his fate without direct evidence. Eddie Pittman was arrested for Jeremiah's murder. The evidence was overwhelming. Rosemary's testimony, the location of the body, the method matching what she described. He would eventually plead guilty to manslaughter, a plea bargain that spared him a murder trial but still guaranteed significant prison time. But Eddie consistently denied any involvement in Zilpha's death. And despite the family's certainty, despite the suspicious timing, despite the obvious motive for silencing someone who knew about Jeremiah's murder, investigators had no physical evidence connecting Eddie to Zilpha's killing. The remains found near Lake James, the crushed skull, the dumped body, none of it definitively pointed to Eddie. The violence was similar, but similarity isn't proof. The timing was suspicious, but suspicion isn't evidence. Jeremiah's case was solved. His family finally knew his fate, finally had a body to bury, and a killer to hold accountable. But Zilpha's murder remained an open question, a wound that couldn't close because the truth remained elusive. The symmetry was haunting. Two people, bound by love and shared trauma, both killed within months of each other, both beaten to death, skulls crushed by savage blows. Both connected to Eddie Pittman, both victims of brutal violence in a quiet West Virginia county where such things weren't supposed to happen. But while Jeremiah's story had reached its conclusion, Zilpha's was just beginning a new chapter, one that would lead investigators down an unexpected path to a trailer, a jail cell, and a horrifying revelation about her final night alive. With Eddie Pittman in custody for Jeremiah's manslaughter, investigators were forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. They couldn't prove he killed Zilpha. The family's certainty meant nothing without evidence. The suspicious timing meant nothing without witnesses. And Eddie's consistent denials, while far from proof of innocence, created reasonable doubt. The investigation into Zilpha's murder had essentially stalled. Her remains had been found, her cause of death established, but the critical questions who killed her and why remained unanswered. The case began to drift toward the cold case files, another unsolved murder in a county with limited investigative resources. Then came the tip that would crack the case wide open, arriving from the most unlikely source, a jail inmate named Ricky. Ricky reached out to investigators with information about Zilpha's disappearance, information he claimed had been weighing on him for months. He directed detectives to another man, Ronald, who had knowledge about suspicious activity on the night Zilpha vanished. Ronald's account was both specific and disturbing. He told investigators about a trailer and described unusual activity he'd witnessed there around the time Zilpha disappeared. He mentioned two men who lived there, names that would become central to solving Zilpha's murder. Investigators tracked down the trailer's former tenants, following a paper trail through rental records and utility bills. The search eventually led them to Robin Whited and Bobby Taylor, two men who had been living together in that trailer during the spring of 1992. When detectives interviewed Robin Whited, they expected denial or evasion. What they got instead was admission. Yes, Robin confirmed, Zilpha had been at the trailer that night. Yes, she had been partying with him and Bobby Taylor. Yes, something terrible had happened. According to Robin, the evening had started casually. Zilpha arrived at the trailer, whether by invitation or chance, and the three of them had been drinking. The atmosphere had been relaxed initially, the kind of impromptu gathering that happens in small communities, where people know each other loosely through work, family connections, or simply crossing paths around town. But the mood shifted dramatically. Robin claimed that Bobby Taylor had made sexual advances towards Zilpha. She refused. Bobby's response to that rejection was rage, immediate, violent, and uncontrollable. What happened next, according to Robin's account, was sustained and brutal violence. Bobby attacked Zilpha with enough force to crush her skull, beating her repeatedly as she lay in the trailer. The blunt force trauma that had puzzled investigators when they found her remains now made terrible sense. She had been bludgeoned in a confined space, unable to escape, unable to defend herself. Robin admitted to having sexual contact with Zilpha that night, but insisted Bobby was responsible for her death. The accusation created immediate investigative complications. Robin was a witness who was also potentially a participant. His credibility was suspect, his motivations unclear. Was he telling the truth to absolve himself of guilt? Or was he trying to shift blame for a murder he'd actually committed? Investigators needed more than Robin's word. They needed physical evidence that could corroborate his story and identify the trailer as the actual murder scene. The problem was obvious. The trailer was still standing, but months had passed since Zilpha's death. Any obvious blood evidence would have been cleaned or degraded. Traditional forensic methods might find nothing. That's when investigators turned to an unusual forensic approach, looking for fly speck. When flies land on blood or biological material, they often regurgitate and defecate, leaving behind microscopic spots that can contain DNA. These specks are tiny, almost invisible to the naked eye, but they can persist long after obvious blood evidence has been cleaned away. They tend to collect on ceilings and upper walls, exactly where someone cleaning blood from floor and furniture might overlook them. The forensic team entered the trailer with specialized equipment, using alternative light sources and magnification to identify potential fly speck. They focused on areas above where Robin said the attack occurred, searching the ceiling and upper walls for the telltale tiny spots. The search yielded results that transformed the entire investigation. They found fly speck on the trailer ceiling. When analyzed, the biological material contained within those microscopic spots yielded DNA. And that DNA matched Zilpha Flores. The implications were staggering. Zilpha had been killed in that trailer, exactly as Robin described. Her blood had spattered in ways that attracted flies, whose feeding habits left behind genetic evidence that would eventually identify the murder scene. The science was exotic, but the conclusion was definitive. This trailer was where Zilpha died. The forensic breakthrough gave investigators leverage they desperately needed. They now had physical evidence placing Zilpha at the murder scene, corroboration for Robin's account, and probable cause to pursue Bobby Taylor more aggressively. Bobby was in federal prison on unrelated charges when investigators confronted him with the new evidence. His initial response was to acknowledge that yes, Zilpha had been at the trailer that night. She had been partying with them. But his admission stopped there. When pressed about the murder itself, Bobby shut down completely. He refused to discuss what happened after Zilpha arrived. He wouldn't address the allegations about sexual advances and violent rage. He wouldn't explain how Zilpha ended up dead with her skull crushed and her body dumped near Lake James. His silence was strategic and infuriating. By admitting Zilpha's presence but refusing to discuss her death, Bobby avoided outright lies that could be disproven, while still protecting himself from confession. It was the response of someone who knew exactly what he was guilty of, but also understood the evidentiary hurdles investigators faced. Robin's testimony, combined with the flyspeck DNA evidence, created a compelling case against Bobby Taylor. But compelling isn't the same as conclusive. Without Bobby's confession, without additional witnesses, without more physical evidence tying him directly to the fatal attack, prosecutors faced significant challenges in building a murder case that could survive trial. The reconstruction of Zilpha's final night was devastating for the family to hear. She had gone to that trailer, possibly seeking companionship or escape from the grief of losing Jeremiah. She had been drinking, vulnerable, in the company of men who would prove to be dangerous. When she rejected sexual advances, she was beaten to death with savage brutality. Her skull crushed in a sustained attack that spoke to rage beyond reason. Her body had then been removed from the trailer, wrapped in the sheet, and accompanied by the towel that would later be found with her remains and driven to the remote woods near Lake James. Someone had carried her lifeless form into those trees and simply left her there, exposed to the elements, for hunters to eventually discover. The casual cruelty of it was overwhelming. Zilpha, who had spent her life caring for others, who had loved Jeremiah with fierce devotion, who had tried to bring her nephew's killer to justice, she had been murdered by someone who then discarded her body like trash. But even with Robin's account and the DNA evidence, the case against Bobby Taylor remained frustratingly incomplete. The legal system required proof beyond reasonable doubt. And while investigators were convinced they knew who killed Zilpha, convincing a jury would be another matter entirely. The family was once again caught in an agonizing limbo. They knew what happened to Zilpha, knew where she died, knew who likely killed her. But knowing isn't the same as proving, and justice remained elusive. The confrontation between investigators and Bobby Taylor in federal prison represented a moment where truth and justice diverged in ways that would haunt everyone involved. Bobby sat across from detectives, arms crossed, expression carefully neutral, and admitted only what he knew could be proven, that Zilpha Flores had been at the trailer that night. Everything beyond that admission met with stony silence or flat denial. Did he attack her? No comment. Did he crush her skull in a rage? No answer. Did he help dispose of her body in the woods near Lake James? He simply stared back, refusing to engage. Robin Whitehead's statements painted Bobby as a violent killer who couldn't handle sexual rejection. The flyspeck DNA confirmed the trailer as the murder scene. The timeline matched, the method matched. But without a confession, without additional witnesses, without Bobby breaking down and admitting what he'd done, the case against him remained circumstantial. Prosecutors faced an agonizing calculation. They could charge Bobby with Zilpha's murder based on the evidence they had. Robin's testimony would be central, but his credibility was compromised by his admitted presence during the crime and his own sexual contact with Zilpha that night. Defense attorneys would tear him apart on the stand, suggesting he was shifting blame to protect himself. The flyspeck DNA was powerful evidence, but it only proved Zilpha died in the trailer. It didn't definitively prove who killed her. Bobby's presence there was admitted, but presence alone isn't proof of murder. Without Bobby's confession or additional corroborating evidence, securing a conviction at trial was far from guaranteed. The decision about whether to formally charge Bobby Taylor would weigh prosecutorial resources, the strength of the evidence, the likelihood of conviction, and the family's desperate need for justice against the risk of an acquittal that would close the case permanently. Meanwhile, Eddie Pittman's case moved through the judicial system with grim efficiency. Rosemary Garing's testimony about Jeremiah's murder was so detailed and credible that Eddie's defense options were limited. The physical evidence corroborated every element of her account, the location of the body, the presence of lime, the blunt force trauma, the timeline. Rather than face a murder trial where the evidence against him was overwhelming, Eddie accepted a plea bargain to manslaughter. The charge reduction acknowledged some mitigating circumstances or evidentiary considerations that allowed prosecutors to secure a conviction without the uncertainty of trial. Eddie Pittman was sentenced and sent to prison for killing his own son. But throughout the legal proceedings, he maintained his innocence regarding Zilpha's death. He admitted to Jeremiah's killing reluctantly through his plea but insisted he had nothing to do with Zilpha's murder. His denial created a complex emotional landscape for the family. They finally had justice for Jeremiah. His murderer was imprisoned, the case was solved, and they could lay Jeremiah to rest, knowing the truth about his fate. The closure was profound and necessary, even if it came with the devastating confirmation that his own father had killed him. But Zilpha's case remained a wound that wouldn't heal. The family remained convinced Eddie was responsible for both murders, that he'd killed Zilpha to silence her after she started making accusations about Jeremiah's disappearance. The timeline supported this theory. Zilpha vanished shortly after Jeremiah, after her dreams and suspicions became public knowledge. Yet the evidence pointed in a different direction, toward Bobby Taylor and that trailer where Zilpha spent her final hours. The physical evidence, Robin's testimony, the forensic breakthroughs, all of it suggested Zilpha's murder was separate from Jeremiah's, committed by different people for different reasons. The possibility that Zilpha's death was unconnected to Jeremiah's was, in some ways, even more tragic. It meant her protective instincts about her nephew, her vocal accusations against Eddie, her desperate attempts to bring attention to Jeremiah's disappearance, none of it had gotten her killed. She had simply been in the wrong place, at the wrong time, had rejected the wrong man's advances, had died for reasons completely unrelated to the nephew she'd loved so fiercely. Or perhaps both theories contained truth. Perhaps Eddie had killed Jeremiah and might have eventually targeted Zilpha, but Bobby Taylor reached her first. Perhaps her murder was both random violence and the tragic culmination of her dangerous knowledge. The complexity refused easy resolution. Zilpha Flores and Kari Gonzalez, Zilpha's nieces who had been closest to her, struggled to process the investigation's findings. They had spent months certain that Eddie Pittman was responsible for both deaths, certain that Zilpha had been silenced for knowing too much. Learning that her murder might have occurred in a trailer at the hands of men who killed her for refusing sex added layers of horror to an already unbearable loss. The different nature of the two murders struck them as deeply unjust. Jeremiah had been killed by someone he knew, someone who should have protected him, his own father. The betrayal was profound, but at least there was a sick logic to it. A family drama that had turned fatal. But Zilpha had been killed by casual acquaintances, murdered in a moment of rejected entitlement, her body dumped like she had never mattered at all. The community reaction to the solved and partially solved cases was complex. Some felt vindicated in their suspicions about Eddie Pittman, finally seeing him held accountable for at least one of the deaths. Others were shocked by the revelation about Bobby Taylor and the trailer, having never suspected that Zilpha's murder might have different perpetrators than they'd assumed. The question of Zilpha's dream remained the most haunting element of the entire case. How had she known Jeremiah was buried with lime? The accuracy was too specific to dismiss as coincidence, too detailed to attribute to lucky guessing or general knowledge about body disposal. Investigators and family members discussed various theories. Perhaps Eddie had made some comment to Zilpha, not realizing she would understand its significance. Perhaps Zilpha had been present during discussions about Jeremiah's murder, without others realizing she was within earshot. Perhaps Rosemary had told her something in passing that Zilpha's subconscious later constructed into the dream narrative. Or perhaps, and this was the explanation that resonated most deeply with those who knew her, Zilpha's bond with Jeremiah was so profound that she simply knew. Perhaps her intuition was so powerful, her connection to him so deep, that she could sense his fate even without direct evidence. Some things can't be explained through logic or investigation. Some bonds transcend conventional understanding. The dream took on symbolic significance beyond its practical value in solving the case. It represented everything Zilpha had been: intuitive, protective, unwilling to let go even when doing so might have saved her life. She had known something terrible happened to Jeremiah, had felt it in ways she couldn't articulate except through the language of dreams, and had refused to stop seeking truth. That persistence, that refusal to accept easy explanations or official dismissals, that fierce loyalty to a nephew who had already been killed, all of it defined who Zilpha was, and, potentially, why she ended up dead. Whether Bobby Taylor killed her randomly or whether her vocal suspicions about Eddie had somehow made her a target that Bobby simply happened to eliminate, the common thread was her unwillingness to stay silent. Years after both murders were discovered, after Eddie Pittman had served time for manslaughter and the question of Bobby Taylor's prosecution had been resolved one way or another, the family still gathered to remember Jeremiah and Zilpha. They talked about the bond between aunt and nephew, about the trauma they'd witnessed together, about the fierce, protective love that defined their relationship. They talked about how that bond had ultimately failed to save either of them, but had at least ensured neither was forgotten. Zilpha's dream had led investigators to Jeremiah's body. Her vocal suspicions had kept pressure on law enforcement. Her refusal to accept his disappearance as voluntary had prevented his case from going completely cold. In death, as in life, Zilpha had protected Jeremiah. She had made sure the truth emerged, even though the truth came too late to save either of them. The family also acknowledged the uncomfortable reality that justice had been partial at best. Eddie Pittman was in prison, yes, but for manslaughter rather than murder, his sentence less than what many felt his crime deserved. Bobby Taylor's fate depended on prosecutorial decisions about evidence, strength, and conviction likelihood, meaning Zilpha's killer might never face the consequences her family believed he deserved. The West Virginia landscape that had once been merely beautiful now held darker associations. The remote ditch where Jeremiah was buried with lime, exactly as Zilpha had dreamed. The woods near Lake James, where hunters found Zilpha's crushed skull and discarded body. The trailer, where violence erupted over rejected sexual advances. The interstate, where Jeremiah's abandoned truck first signaled something was terribly wrong. Each location marked a point in the terrible geography of two intertwined tragedies. The county had always been quiet, the kind of place where violent crime was rare enough to shock. But these cases revealed that violence could be hiding in plain sight, in family relationships, in casual acquaintances, in the space between official investigation and obvious truth. The silence that Jeremiah and Zilpha had maintained after witnessing Eddie's arson years before had been their first shared secret. That silence had bound them together, created a covenant of mutual protection. But ultimately, neither could protect the other from the violence that would claim both their lives. The final cruel irony was that Zilpha's most desperate act of protection, her dream-driven conviction about Jeremiah's murder, her vocal accusations, her refusal to let his disappearance be forgotten, had come after Jeremiah was already dead. She couldn't save him. All she could do was ensure he was found, ensure the truth emerged, ensure he wasn't lost forever in an unmarked grave. And in doing that, in being so publicly certain about Jeremiah's fate, she may have signed her own death warrant, whether by attracting Eddie's lethal attention or simply by being out in the world, vulnerable, seeking comfort or distraction that would lead her to a trailer and a man who would kill her for saying no. The story of Jeremiah Pittman and Zilpha Flores is a story about bonds that transcend normal family relationships, about violence that simmers beneath quiet surfaces, about dreams that reveal truth in ways logic cannot explain, and about the terrible inadequacy of justice even when cases are technically solved. Jeremiah's murder was solved. Eddie Pittman pled guilty. Rosemary Gehring's testimony led investigators to the exact spot where lime-covered remains waited to be discovered. The family got answers, got closure, got the bitter satisfaction of knowing the truth. Zilpha's murder was explained, if not fully resolved. Robin Whitehead's testimony and flyspeck DNA established what happened and where, even if Bobby Taylor's silence prevented the complete catharsis of confession. The family understood how she died, understood the random cruelty that ended her life, understood that her protective instincts about Jeremiah might have been completely unrelated to her own murder. But understanding isn't the same as peace. Knowing isn't the same as healing. Justice partially served still leaves wounds that can't fully close. In the end, the case that shocked everyone wasn't shocking because it was unprecedented. Fathers have killed sons before. Men have murdered women for rejecting sexual advances before. Protective family members have died trying to seek justice before. None of these elements were unique. What shocked people was the accumulation: 2 deaths, 1 family, prophetic dreams, lime-covered graves, abandoned trucks, crushed skulls, trailer fly speck, prison interviews, partial confessions, and the terrible symmetry of 2 people bound by love and trauma, both ending up victims of brutal violence within months of each other. It was the details that made the story unforgettable. The specificity of Zilpha's dream, the casual cruelty of dumping her body in the woods, the betrayal of Eddie killing his own son, the randomness of Zilpha's final night, the forensic breakthrough of finding DNA in fly excrement, the jail inmate tip that broke open a cold case. And above all, it was the bond between Zilpha and Jeremiah that gave the story its tragic power. They had witnessed violence together as younger people and kept silent to protect themselves. They had built a relationship based on that shared trauma and mutual protection. And they had both died violently, possibly because of that bond, or possibly despite it, leaving behind family members who would never stop wondering what might have been different if that protective love had somehow been enough. West Virginia, in 1992, was supposed to be quiet, safe, unremarkable. 2 disappearances, 2 murders, and years of investigation later, the community learned that safety is often an illusion, that violence can touch anyone, and that even the most fierce protective love sometimes isn't enough to save the people we care about most. The truth, when it finally emerged, didn't shock because it was unbelievable. It shocked because it was all too believable. A painful reminder that the worst possibilities are sometimes exactly what happened, that dreams can be prophetic, that family bonds can make you a target, and that justice is often incomplete, even when truth finally comes to light. Jeremiah Pittman and Zilpha Flores deserved better protection, better investigation, better justice, and better outcomes than the ones they got. Their story serves as a testament to the love between them, the violence that destroyed them both, and the persistent questions that linger even after cases are officially closed. Some wounds never fully heal. Some questions never get complete answers, and some bonds, even death, cannot completely sever. The abandoned truck on the interstate, the dream about lime, the crushed skulls, the fly speck DNA, the silent confession that never came, the manslaughter plea, the trailer that held terrible secrets. These are the fragments that remain after truth emerges and justice is partially served. For Reba and Carrie and all who loved Jeremiah and Zilpha, these fragments don't add up to complete understanding or thorough healing. They're pieces of a terrible puzzle that shows its picture even with some pieces forever missing. Zilpha's intuition saved no one, least of all herself. But it did ensure that Jeremiah wasn't lost forever, that truth eventually emerged, that their stories were told and their deaths investigated. In the end, perhaps that's all protective love can do. Ensure we're not forgotten, ensure the truth matters, ensure someone cares enough to keep asking questions until answers finally come. Even incomplete answers, even painful answers, even answers that reveal just how random and cruel violence can be, how insufficient our protections are, how inadequate justice sometimes feels even when it's technically achieved. The cold case that shocked everyone did so not because the truth was unimaginable, but because it was all too real, a reminder that beneath the quiet surface of any community, violence and tragedy can be waiting, and that the bonds we form to protect each other are sometimes exactly what makes us vulnerable. Jeremiah and Zilpha witnessed fire together and kept each other's secrets. They died violently, possibly because of those secrets, definitely because violence found them both. Their story is over, but the questions linger, the pain persists, and the memory of their bond remains a bittersweet reminder of love that couldn't quite save either of them from the darkness they'd spent their lives trying to escape.